There is a reason that the darkest chapters of Appalachian history are so often written around men of the cloth. It is not that faith produces evil. It is that faith, in communities of the kind that existed in the mountain hollows of 19th century Tennessee, produced a specific kind of authority, total, unquestioned, rooted in the belief that the person exercising it was operating as an instrument of something larger than any human law. A physician's authority extends only as far as the body. A sheriff's authority ends at the county line. A preacher's authority, in a congregation that believed the Bible was the direct and literal word of God and that the preacher was its appointed interpreter, extended everywhere, into every decision, every relationship, every room of every house in his flock. It extended into the parts of a person's life that they had not chosen to share with any earthly institution. It extended into their fears and their secrets, and the things they had done that they believed would be held against them at a judgment more consequential than any county court. Amos Bledsoe understood this. He had understood it from the beginning of his ministry in Carter County, Tennessee in 1882. He used it as methodically and as deliberately as any instrument he had ever put his hands to for 22 years in a congregation of approximately 60 souls on the upper Watauga River Valley until the autumn of 1904, when Bledsoe died of a stroke at 58 years old, and the church deacons, charged with managing his estate and his records, opened the wooden chest he kept in the vestry office and found the contents that he had been certain, right up until the moment he died, would never be found. What was in that chest is the subject of this account. The chest is in the Carter County Historical Society archive in Elizabethton, Tennessee. It has been there since 1905, when the deacons donated it to the Historical Society following a proceeding before the county probate court that produced more questions than it answered, and that the participants, by mutual agreement, chose not to pursue further. The chest itself is unremarkable, a plain pine box with a brass hasp, the kind sold at any hardware store. What it contains is something that the county's official record has spent 120 years carefully failing to describe in full. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. The Watauga River Valley in Carter County has been settled since before the Revolution. The congregation Amos Bledsoe served for 22 years is long gone. The church building is gone. But the chest is still there in Elizabethton, and it is still mostly closed to casual researchers, and the reasons for that are part of what this story is about. Carter County, Tennessee in 1882 was a county in the first generation of its post-war identity, a mountain county that had been predominantly Unionist during the Civil War, that had suffered the particular violence that comes from communities divided against themselves, and that had emerged from the war with its social structures intact in form but damaged in every other sense. The churches were the most stable institutions remaining. They had not split the way some lowland Southern denominations had split over slavery. They had absorbed the wartime fractures of their communities and had reconstituted themselves around the only authority that had never wavered, the text, the pulpit, the weekly gathering of people who needed to believe that something in the world was reliable and fixed and not subject to the chaos that the preceding decade had demonstrated everything else was subject to. Into this landscape came Amos Bledsoe in the autumn of 1882. He arrived from Unicoi County, where he had served a brief and apparently unremarkable initial posting following his ordination, and he came to the upper Watauga River Valley, carrying the standard credentials of a newly ordained Baptist minister, and nothing else that the community could assess at first glance. He was given access to a small timber-framed building that had served the community's worship needs on an irregular basis, and he began holding services the first Sunday of October, 1882. 14 people attended that first service. By the following spring, there were 30. By 1885, the building had been expanded, and the congregation numbered 51 souls by the count in Bledsoe's own church register, a register that, unlike the private ledger, was entirely orthodox in its contents and was exactly what a congregation register should be. Into this landscape came Amos Bledsoe in the autumn of 1882. He was 36 years old at the time, newly ordained, a large man with the kind of physical presence that made a room feel occupied from the moment he entered it. His build came from the particular labor of a man who had grown up farming the mountain soil. Broad shoulders, thick hands with knuckles scarred from a decade of fieldwork before he had turned to preaching, a frame that suggested not bulk, but the deep anchored strength of someone who had never stopped working outdoors. His voice was the primary instrument of his ministry, and he knew it, a resonant, unhurried bass that carried authority without effort and that could, in a small timber-framed church building, fill the room in a way that felt less like sound and more like presence. His eyes were described in the testimony of multiple congregation members as dark and direct, eyes that several witnesses noted with a phrasing that was independently similar across multiple accounts, seemed to know things about you that you had not told him. He was, by every account that precedes the autumn of 1904, an effective pastor. The letters of recommendation he had received from Unicoi County were warm and specific. The ministers in neighboring churches in Carter County who encountered him at association meetings described him as theologically rigorous and personally impressive. The county newspaper mentioned his congregation twice in the 1890s, once when they completed the addition to their building, once when a mission collection they had organized exceeded expectations. He was, in every visible particular, exactly what a successful rural Appalachian pastor looked like in the 1880s and 1890s. The visible particulars were impeccable. The invisible ones are what the chest contains. The congregation grew under his ministry. His sermons were long and demanding. He did not spare the difficult passages, did not soften the doctrine, did not treat the congregation as an audience, but as a body of souls whose eternal condition was his personal responsibility. People who found this approach too rigorous left. People who found it clarifying or who needed the particular certainty it offered stayed and over time organized their lives around it. By the mid-1890s, the Bledsoe congregation on the Upper Watauga was one of the most cohesive small religious communities in Carter County. Tightly networked, strongly identified, governed by an internal social order in which the pastor's authority was not merely spiritual but practical and comprehensive. He advised on marriages, he mediated property disputes, he counseled the bereaved, the troubled, the sick, and the shamed. He knew more about every family in his congregation than anyone else in the valley. He had collected that knowledge deliberately over 22 years, and he had used it in ways that the wooden chest in the vestry office documented with a precision that exceeded anything the official record was prepared to absorb when the deacons finally opened it in October 1904. The deacons were two in number, a farmer named Calvert Hicks, age 61, who had been in the congregation since its founding and who had known Bledsoe longer than any other surviving member, and a younger man named Ira Pruitt, aged 34, who had joined the congregation 14 years earlier when he married into one of the Valley families. Both men had, by the standard of their relationship with Bledsoe, been trusted members of his inner circle, the men he consulted on practical matters, the men who assisted at the Lord's table, the men whose loyalty to his ministry had been demonstrated over years of service. Both men had been in those private accounts for years without knowing it. The deacons were two in number, a farmer named Calvert Hicks, age 61, who had been in the congregation since its founding, and a younger man named Ira Pruitt, age 34, who had joined 14 years earlier and had served as deacon for the past 6. They opened the chest 2 weeks after Bledsoe's funeral in the presence of a county probate attorney named James Selman, who had been brought in to oversee the estate accounting. Selman's report to the probate court, filed November 12, 1904, is the official record of what was found. It is written in the careful, condensed language of a man who has decided that a legal document is not the appropriate place for the full description of what he has seen, and that the legal minimum will have to serve. The report notes that the chest contained personal correspondence, financial records, and documents of a private nature pertaining to members of the congregation, the content of which is not relevant to the estate proceeding. It recommends that the documents be secured pending further review and that the estate matter be handled separately from any questions the documents might raise. The documents of a private nature. That phrase contains the full weight of what was in the chest, and what it contains is best understood through the account given by Calvert Hicks to his son in a letter written the following week, a letter that the Hicks family preserved and donated to the Carter County Historical Society in 1961, along with the chest itself. Hicks wrote to his son, "There were letters, more letters than I knew he had received or sent over 20 years. Letters from families in the congregation, not letters to the church, not formal correspondence, but private letters, the kind you write when you are asking someone for help with something you cannot discuss openly." I recognized some of the names. I recognized some of the situations the letters described because I had lived through this community for 22 years alongside the people who wrote them. The letters were not what disturbed me most. What disturbed me most was a separate set of documents, not letters from the congregation to Bledsoe, but documents in Bledsoe's own hand. Records, accounts. He had kept accounts of what he knew about people. He had kept accounts of what he had asked of them and what they had given him in exchange for his silence or his assistance. I recognized those accounts too. I had not known, until I read them, that I was in them. Calvert Hicks was in the accounts. Ira Pruitt was in the accounts. The accounts documented not only what Bledsoe knew, but what he had done with what he knew, the specific instances, the specific requests, the specific exchanges. This is the portion of the documentary record that no researcher has publicly described, because the board review policy has prevented full access. What Hicks's letter to his son establishes is the general character of the accounts, that Bledsoe had used information acquired in the pastoral relationship, information given to him in the context of spiritual counsel, information the givers had believed was private and sacred, as material for a sustained exercise in quiet, patient leverage. Not threats, not demands, requests, favors, the kind of thing that a pastor might reasonably ask of a congregation member, except that the asking was calibrated to what Bledsoe knew and what the congregation member needed him to continue not disclosing. Calvert Hicks was in the accounts. Ira Pruitt was in the accounts. Virtually every family in the congregation was in the accounts. The ledger that Bledsoe had kept, not the financial ledger of church accounts, which was separate and in good order, but the private ledger, the one that Hicks described in his letter and that the probate attorney described in language that minimized without quite erasing, documented 22 years of Bledsoe's use of his pastoral knowledge as a tool of leverage. Not extortion in the crude, direct sense, something more graduated and more durable than extortion. A pastor who knew the things you had done, the things you had confided to him as part of the ongoing relationship of spiritual accountability that his ministry demanded, and who occasionally asked for things in return, not money, or not primarily money, but compliance, deference, the particular form of loyalty that comes from the understanding that someone holds information that could damage you, and that his continued goodwill is the condition of that information remaining private. He had built this over 22 years with the patience of a man who understood that the most durable forms of authority are the ones that the subjects cooperate in maintaining. The specific nature of what Bledsoe had known about his congregation and what he had asked in exchange for keeping it is not fully described in any document that has been made publicly accessible from the Carter County Historical Society archive. The chest is in the archive. The letters and accounts are in the chest. Access to the chest requires a formal research request that, as of the most recent information available, is reviewed by a board that includes representatives of the families whose ancestors appear in the documents. Whether any researcher has been granted full access and whether such a researcher has published findings from that access is not established in any record I have been able to locate. The chest has been in the archive since 1905. It has been there for 120 years. The families whose ancestors are in those documents are still in Carter County. The board review policy has been in place since at least the 1960s, when Calvert Hicks's son donated the family letter along with the chest. What the probate proceeding established, the portion of the record that is fully accessible, is this. Amos Bledsoe had, over his 22 years of ministry, received gifts of land, money, and services from congregation members at rates that exceeded anything a pastor of a small rural congregation would normally receive through normal church giving. These gifts were documented in the financial records and were not individually unusual enough to trigger scrutiny. Taken together and read against the private accounts that the deacons found in the chest, they form a pattern that the probate court described as irregular and recommended be referred to the county attorney for further review. The county attorney reviewed the matter, determined that Bledsoe was dead, and that the criminal statute applicable to the pattern of behavior described would, in any case, have been difficult to apply to what had occurred given the voluntary nature of the transactions, and closed the review without further action. The families who appeared in the accounts were not notified officially. Whether they were notified informally, whether Hicks and Pruitt, who had read the accounts, told anyone whose name they had recognized, is not in any record. Hicks's letter to his son does not address this directly. It ends with a single sentence that does not resolve any of the questions it raises. I have decided that the chest should go somewhere. It will be kept and not destroyed, and that what is done with it after I am gone is not mine to determine. The church itself disbanded within 2 years of Bledsoe's death. The building was sold and later demolished. The congregation dispersed into other churches in the valley. By 1910, there was no visible trace in the Carter County religious landscape of the community that Bledsoe had built and maintained for 22 years. The families he had known, whose secrets he had kept in that wooden chest with the brass hasp, went on living in the valley alongside one another, carrying what they had done and what had been done to them, and the chest sat in the Historical Society archive in Elizabethton and waited for a researcher with the right combination of persistence and access and willingness to read what Calvert Hicks had read in October 1904, and write, "I recognized those accounts. I had not known until I read them that I was in them." There is one more detail from the 1904 probate proceeding that has not been addressed in any account of Amos Bledsoe's ministry, and it comes from a notation in probate attorney James Selman's personal diary, a diary held in the East Tennessee State University Special Collections in Johnson City, where it was donated by Selman's granddaughter in 1979. Selman wrote about the Bledsoe estate matter on 3 occasions in October and November 1904, and his diary entries are more candid than his official report in the way that private diaries always are. The final entry on the subject, dated November 18, 1904, reads, "I have completed the estate matter to the satisfaction of the court and the deacons. The chest is to go to the Historical Society, which is where I believe it belongs, in a place that will keep it without being required to use it. What I found in those documents I will not reproduce here. I will say only that I have practiced probate law in Carter County for 19 years, and I have seen the inside of a great many men's affairs, and I have never before encountered a man who kept such careful accounts of other people's vulnerabilities. He was thorough. He was patient. He was, in the technical sense, brilliant at what he did. Whether what he did was evil in the conventional sense, or whether it was something else, a kind of accumulated opportunism that began in smaller places and grew over 22 years into what I found in that chest, I cannot determine. I only know that I closed the chest and I locked it and I gave it to the Historical Society and I came home and I did not sleep. Today, the Carter County Historical Society in Elizabethton maintains the chest in its restricted collection. The upper Watauga River Valley where Bledsoe's congregation gathered is still settled, still farmed, still churched. Different congregations, different families, but the same terrain and the same kind of community. The descendants of the families in those accounts are there. The chest is in Elizabethton. 120 years of distance separates the documents from the people they describe, and the board review policy exists, at least in part, to ensure that that distance is not casually closed by a researcher who does not understand what closing it would mean for the families still living in that valley. Here is the question that Amos Bledsoe leaves behind, and it is about authority rather than individual evil. He used the tools of his office, the pastoral relationship, the confessional intimacy, the asymmetric knowledge that comes from being the person a community turns to at its most exposed, to build a form of leverage that was not criminal in any simple sense and was not, in any individual instance, distinguishable from the legitimate exercise of pastoral authority. What made it what it was, rather than what it appeared to be, was the ledger, the record, the accumulation of what he knew, indexed and cross-referenced and available for use. Without the ledger, Bledsoe's ministry looks like a ministry. With the ledger, it looks like something else, a 22-year operation that used the machinery of faith as its mechanism and the trust of a congregation as its raw material. Was Amos Bledsoe a man who began with genuine belief and arrived, gradually and perhaps without a clear moment of transition, at what the ledger documents? Or was the ledger the point from the beginning? Was the ministry the instrument, faith the cover, and the wooden chest with the brass hasp the actual product of 22 years of work in Carter County? The answer is in the chest, in documents that have not been publicly described in any source I have found. The answer is waiting in Elizabethton, in a restricted collection, behind a board review that the families of Carter County have maintained for 60 years to protect people who are now dead from a record that is over 100 years old. Tell me in the comments what you think was in those accounts. Tell me what you think he asked for. Tell me whether the faith that his congregation gave him made what he did worse than what a secular man with the same information would have done, or whether faith is simply irrelevant to the ledger, and the ledger is all that matters. If these sealed archives and restricted collections and the records that communities have maintained for generations to protect the dead from their own documented history are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. The chest is in Elizabethton. The hasp is still brass. 120 years have not changed what is inside it. The mountains keep their preachers' secrets. Some of those preachers kept their own.